Hello, I am Talip Küçükcan, and I welcome you to the Digital Debates by the TRT World Forum. Today, we are going to look at the challenges that the Biden administration is facing, especially with regard to the transatlantic relations, and also, of course, in the broader sense with the international politics. Today, I have got excellent speakers on the panel. Professor John Ikenberry, he is the Professor of Politics and International Affairs at Princeton University. John, welcome to join us today. Thank you very much. And we have got Leslie Vinjamuri, Director of US and Americas Program at Chatham House, and also she is an Associate Professor in International Relations at School of Oriental and African Studies at London University. And I also welcome Professor Elaine Fahey. She is the Jean Monnet Chair in Law and Transatlantic Relations. She is a professor of law at the City Law School at the City University, which is also located in London. John, I just would like to begin with you with a broader question. In your recent book, you claim that there is a crisis with regard to the international liberal order. What is this crisis about, and what are the sources of that crisis? The second part of the question is that how I think EU and, of course, US can deal and tackle with this crisis that we are facing today.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for hosting this event, and it's an honor to be on this panel. Great question, and I think it's more than one crisis. I do think that we are at a kind of historical turning point, a kind of fork in the road where the most basic questions about the organization of the international system are on the table. It's a crisis with multiple levels and dramas that are unfolding. I think at least three crises are unraveling at the same time. One is what we'll call a geopolitical crisis driven by the rise of China and what we might call this kind of historic, once in a century global power transition from the U.S. To China, or at least a slightly less central position of the United States as China rises. And this is triggering all sorts of new issues about leadership, about values, about the nature of international order. China does not wish liberal democracy well. It wants to make the world safe for autocracy. So there's a deep crisis there. The second crisis is what I'll call a crisis of modernity. It's the crisis we see when we go outside of our buildings today. The pandemic is an example of a crisis of cascades of interdependence, economic, political, public health, environmental, that are requiring us to step up our game, not just to restore the cooperation of the old days, but to invent new forms of cooperation with new actors, with much more complex kinds of multilateral challenges. And then thirdly, the crisis of liberal democracy, where inside of the countries that have been the major support for the post-World War II international order, that have identified their own interests with the building of an open, rule-based, progressively oriented international order, that those states are troubled, starting with the United States, but Europe has its own troubles. And so it's a big a context of unstable relations, of uncertainties, of dilemmas, of trade-offs. And so we have the United States, as you asked us to focus on, coming into the world with a new leader, seeking to reestablish leadership. And I'll just say that, and I know we'll talk more about the Biden administration, and my colleagues will have much more to say about the agenda for U.S.-European relations. But I think that the most important thing we see coming out of the United States today in the period of the Biden administration is an attempt to return to America's 75-year playbook of identifying American interests with the building of a more stable, cooperative international order, to identify its leadership with not just its own power, but with creating an environment, an ecosystem of cooperation, so that starting with liberal democracies, but the wider system can work together. I think there are two two steps at the broadest level that the Biden administration is attempting to use as signals for this new period. One is returning to the fold of international cooperation, rejoining the Paris Agreement on environment, rejoining the WHO, hosting an international conference on global warming, tying environmental steps to a kind of reimagination of political economy, of our social contracts. And then secondly, diplomacy and an attempt to reach out to other countries, to move beyond the kind of transactionalism and America first, to work with partners. The U.S. is not going to be able to return to the heady days of superpower unilateral leadership. It needs to work in coalitions and alignments of like-minded states. So when you hear the Biden administration talking about rebuilding the democratic coalition, that's both an ideological statement, but it's a practical statement that we can't do it alone. We need partners, and our most dependable, reliable partners are those that want to see liberal democracy thrive in the 21st century. You've got to your microphone is muted.
Okay, thank you very much. I think, Professor, thank you very much for this, I think, broad analysis of what we are going through and the main challenges that we face. Now, let me go on to Leslie, because as Professor Ikenberry has pointed out, we face a number of crises just there. And it seems that the new world order is emerging because U.S. Needs to partner with other countries and powers. And in your opinion, when we look at the world order, especially the emerging world order, which country or what powers in that sense are the dominant ones, and what are their priorities, what are their objectives? It seems that US is not alone in the competition in international fora.
Yes, I mean, I think this is the, to build on, I guess, some of what Professor Ikenberry has said. There is a lot more contestation, even, of course, with a change in U.S. administration. We know that the shift in the distribution of power has been occurring for quite some time, especially when one thinks about the global economy, which of course it's impossible and I would argue a fool's errand to try to de-link the idea of international security and the global political economy, especially now when values are so deeply contested between the major powers. But the US, relative power has declined. I think that's a big part of why there is so much uncertainty. And clearly, as we all know, China has a major stake in the UN system, as it made very clear at the meetings between the US and China in Anchorage, Alaska, very recently. It's very invested in the UN system. It contests what it refers to as the rules-based order, I think largely because it sees many of those institutions as being deeply vested in America's vision of the liberal international order or the rules-based order and Europe's. But there are other really important powers. And I think while we tend to think about the US and China being locked in an intense competition, but clearly with a necessity that they need to cooperate on the big global public challenges, whether it's climate or health or technology, other powers matter a huge amount to this. And it's not clear which way they lean. I think they would prefer to see themselves as independent. And I'm thinking of India in particular, but also Turkey, obviously. And if we want to even come back closer to home and just think about the transatlantic partners, it's very difficult to talk about Europe in one voice. And as much as we'd like to say, what does Europe think? I think certainly the perception from Washington and from the US is that Europe is far from where it needs to be on the question of being integrated and aligned in its own common position. The UK is very separate now from the EU, but has a very important role in anything to do with questions of security on the European front. So there are a number of major powers that are critical. The US and China are the key players. But the US and certainly the Biden administration has made it very clear that while it's true that there is an attempt to bring America back into the dominant multilateral institutions, to reinvest, to build back better at home, that it wants to do that in partnership, A, with its European allies and partners, and B, that it would really like to work with those very significant countries like India that matter so much, especially when it comes to presenting a common and significant and weighty alternative to much of what China's trying to do. So I think, power is divided, it's diffused, and there's a lot of competition, as we know, but a lot of goodwill for trying to make things happen.
Well, I think that's a very good reply to what I have just asked, the question. Now, I just would like to move on to Elaine. Elaine, if you can turn your mic on. So, as Leslie said, we had, I think, witnessed some issues with regard to the transatlantic relations under the Trump era, under the Trump administration. I think that relation has been damaged, and it's been pointed out that also that played out in the area of multilateralism, bilateralism. What are the main issues with regard to the US and EU partnership? What are the main challenges, whether there are overlapping priorities or divergent issues?
Yeah, thank you very much for this. I think following on from the previous speakers quite nicely, hopefully, I think that one of the most obvious things about the Biden administration is that it's filled with people who were in the Obama administration. And we got so close to having something in the order of a TTIP or really close engagement from a trade perspective. And I think it seems very unlikely that we're going to see anything out there. There's so many battle-scarred officials in the current administration who will not seek the depth of engagement or cooperation that did not get achieved by the last administration. So I would say by that administration that there are at least 5 specific things that are very specific from a legal perspective. The first is institutions matter. The WTO is on its knees. The EU, the EU's first overture to the US after the election of the new president was to propose a Transatlantic Trade and Technology Council. So to institutionalize the relationship, what will that look like? What can you do? Something falling short of TTIP, falling short of massive WTO reform. How can they work together? What kind of global institutions will they engage through? Because there's been obviously massive deinstitutionalization of EU-US relations throughout the Trump administration. The second agenda where I think the EU and US are really legally aligning very nicely and neatly is the idea of good and fair trade, the Green Deal, climate change, workers' rights, this massive agenda of the Green Deal in particular in Europe, in almost every single policy. It's an extraordinary lawmaking exercise that the EU is trying to do all over the world, and that it seems to be very much a meeting of minds, particularly from the USTR, statements being made, overtures being engaged with. There's a very clear consensus that there will be some kind of transatlantic alignment on these issues, and that it will meaningfully trickle down to a variety of policies. But again, it comes back to this question of what institutions are, what lawmaking processes. The third question, of course, is big tech. The EU has become very aggressively concerned with regulating data, antitrust enforcement, the idea of the gatekeepers, how to rein in, this enormous power of tech companies, largely US tech companies, many with extraordinary, agendas in Europe. And this is all over the world. There are many other legislations doing this. It's not necessarily something new. But what is, significant is the transatlantic alignment, particularly, developments in the US about privacy, the idea of a federal privacy law, federal regulation, this, moving towards the EU GDPR standards. Anu Bradford has a fantastic book out called The Brussels Effect in describing this, this movement of EU standards to the US. That really matters when we talk about big tech. And, very briefly, I think China is an obvious issue where the EU has started off very badly with the US, but we're seeing, significant developments taking place, particularly considering workers' rights and how we understand the nature of the EU's engagements with China. Will this agreement get through the EU institutions? And I suppose just, the fifth major legal question would be standards just generally, and this idea of coming back to the Brussels effect, or to the book project of Cambridge University Press, the Transatlantic Community of Law Self-Promotion here, on how we understand the nature of the transatlantic space, the fact that the EU and US are much closer legally than China, for example, yet China has taken the GDPR, and we know that they use facial recognition technologies for law enforcement purposes and so on, or food standards and so on. Very significant debates taking place in the UK about what it means to be in Europe or not relative to the US. So that would be what I would put as the initial legal questions for the agenda going forward.
Well, I think we will continue about the rift or the areas of cooperation when it comes to US and EU. Now, let me move on to John. John, as Leslie said, the Biden, I think it was one of his first statements. He said that the US will be back, will come back. How do you think US will come back to restore international order, given the complexities around the world? On the one hand, the US administration needs to tackle with the crisis in Syria, in Yemen, in the Middle East, in Palestine, and Israeli issues. On the one hand, Russia is now playing some games in Donbas region, in Ukraine. What are the main challenges, and how do you think he can navigate those uncharted waters?
Well, I think there's actually a big agenda for building back American leadership, and we're still uncertain how far America can come back. Everybody's watching. There's a lot of skepticism. For example, the Biden administration is stepping forward to host an international gathering on climate change, and there are countries that are at least many are coming, and it could well be a big success. But people are saying, how long will the United States be there? What about the next presidential election? How stable is this return? And so I think there are three things that are going to drive the return of American leadership. One is, I think the Biden administration thinks that the most basic thing it can do to signal America can kind of play a role in ordering the world is to focus on the home front, to show that it can tackle the greatest problem of our moment, the pandemic disease, by rolling out the vaccine, and it looks like it's showing some of its capacities to do large-scale logistics, and so showing itself and the world that it can work. There was a poll last fall of German citizens who found 71% of Germans think the American system is broken. So how can the United States work with Germany if Germany doesn't think America is a workable country? So I think showing that the United States can overcome its own domestic problems, at least to become credible. Secondly, I think this theme that we've raised, and Professor Fahey has also just very nicely emphasized, which is rebuilding institutions, going back to the repair job on the WTO, on trade agreements, finding alignments, and working on the kind of infrastructure of international multilateral cooperation. And then thirdly, I do think there is an agenda of related to finding a credible response to the rise of China. This doesn't mean a containment coalition against China, but it does mean that the most basic things that will determine the shape of the international order in 10, 20, 30 years will be about the rules of the road for international relations. And will those rules of the road be written by liberal democracies, or will they be written by what could well be then the most powerful country that is drifting towards totalitarianism, towards a very different model of modernity? It's not
John. Do you think
we have an opportunity for strengthening cooperation on how do we respond to the rise of China?
Do you think, at this context, the Biden administration will invest in democracy promotion that previous administrations have done so in the past? The idea of democracy promotion, which didn't seem to be working quite well in many places.
Well, I think I think you're right, and I think that there has been a general retreat from those heady days after the Cold War ended, when it looked like the world was going in the direction of liberal democracy, and countries wanted to join a kind of bandwagon of history. That's gone, I think, and there's no question that countries have to make up their own minds. What kind of world do they want to live in? And I don't think we should whether I'm speaking for the U.S. or for the wider world of democracies, we should be engaged in the kind of aggressive regime change kind of policies that we saw in Iraq and we may see in other places, but to offer a more positive agenda of how open societies who believe in the rule of law and want to protect these kind of basic Enlightenment values can work together. Whether China joins or not is in some sense irrelevant. It's making the case that there is a kind of a core of countries that want to operate and protect their institutions. We're in for a huge challenge, as I think we all agree, from new technologies and the dangers that artificial intelligence and big data authoritarian forms of rule put on the world. So I think there is a real challenge there that can unite countries that want to ship and shape the world in the direction that we're envisaging.
Well, thank you for these insights. Leslie, I think we should come to the issue of globalization, because globalization is still going on and expanding. Does it bring challenges, or does it bring new opportunities, a window of opportunity, especially to tackle with the new and emerging issues in the international agenda, like COVID, like authoritarianism, like many conflicts or economic issues, poverty, etc., and how that plays out in the U.S.-EU relations?
So, I mean, globalization, I think that the interesting thing about globalization, and it does link to the recent interventions by Professor Fahey and Professor Ikenberry, isn't new. I think there's a question of, what are the key challenges that come out of the diffusion of technology and the development of new technologies, and how do they affect, or how do they get caught up in questions about globalization and standard setting and values to be key. And I think to pick up on something that Professor Ikenberry said, I think it isn't so much about democracy promotion, but it is about contestation. And contestation over whose values will shape and drive globalization, and especially the norms and the standards and the rules and the decision-making procedures for agreeing things at the multilateral level, I think is really critical. So while we're no longer, I don't think the US or and certainly not Europe are in the game of using military force to change, who's in power in any given country. And by the way, the decision on Afghanistan is whether we agree or disagree with either the decision or the way that it's been, the fact that it's not conditions-based, it is a sign that the US intends to get out of this game. But I think that contestation, putting forward alternative norms, or trying to shape the values that define globalization and the concrete increments, right, the technologies of globalization, are absolutely critical. That's the first thing. And the second thing is, I think that, to use a very old phrase that I think still rings true, keeping the space alive. So a lot of countries, one doesn't want to pretend that the millions of people across China have any desire to be a democracy in the way that the United States is. But at the same time, there are plenty of people in many countries that do want the space to be kept alive for robust, free civil society engagement, freedom of expression, freedom to protest, and any other number of freedoms. And so contestation that signals to people as opposed to states that those values matter, that they're manifest in the multilaterals, that they're manifest where possible, when possible, through transnationalism and through funding, I think is absolutely critical. So yes, globalization is taking on different forms. It's absolutely critical. States are holding on to it and trying to control it, I think, much more or indifferently than they used to. But injecting values into the debate, I think it is absolutely critical. But the defense of democracy, is I think how people are thinking about it. I think we also need to think about the defense of human rights as opposed to human rights promotion. And this, I don't think we've seen as much movement on. And I would point to the recent tit-for-tat human rights sanctions that the US, the UK, and Europe placed on China, and the response from China that, you know, whatever we think, how abhorrent the atrocities are in China against the Uyghurs and in Xinjiang, you know, what does it amount to? And so I ask the question, what do human rights sanctions amount to? What are the right mechanisms and methodologies for trying to defend as opposed to promote human rights? And I think there's not a lot of good thinking on that yet.
Okay, coming back to the values, Leslie, and I think US and EU share many values when it comes to, you know, democracy, human rights, rule of law, etc. To what extent this cooperation between EU and US might bring a new energy in the global stage when they bring forces together?
So I think, yeah, if we can get the United States under the Biden administration and the Europeans, and I would say more than just the EU, right? The UK has a big role to play, and many members of the EU think, you know, bilaterally as well as through the EU. But if that partnership can be revived in a serious way, then I think that has the potential, not necessarily to be transformative, but to really make it possible to revive key components of the existing order. I guess I'm on the side of those who are, you know, very, very cautious in my optimism, because Europeans are deeply skeptical, about America's engagement and its ability to sustain its engagement in the world. And to John's very important point, they're very skeptical about America and the extent to which America is divided and seemingly broken. And frankly, I think Europeans are more skeptical than they should be, in large part because travel's broken down and people are looking at America primarily through the lens of the media, which paints the worst possible picture of the United States, with one exception, which is the news of the vaccine dissemination. And so Europeans are no longer coming to America. A lot of Europeans are not allowed to come to America. And they're not actually, and you know, clearly there are still very serious health risks to travel. So people are no longer embracing the positive image. But if that partnership can be revived, and let's be fair, the UK hasn't had the best image globally. It hasn't been well received in the US. The Brexit has taken a toll on Britain's global image, as have a number of internal divisions and the sense that Britain's become very parochial and perhaps is now coming out of that, but we all wait to see. And Europe has looked very divided. And now actually Europe, I think in the US, is seen as not really struggling when it comes to coming out of the pandemic. So there are a lot of perceptions that don't necessarily help build trust and confidence in the common agenda. But I am still optimistic. And I think to the extent that the US and its European partners can come together, they share common values, they share a lot of orientations, they don't share all their interests. And I think that, you know, recognition that interests are not perfectly the same, but can nonetheless be aligned is a really important place to start.
Well, thank you very much. I think now we can talk about the new challenges that's been mentioned by all speakers. Elaine, I think cybersecurity is one of the new challenges, cyber attacks, you know, and also intervention in elections in some countries. I think we have seen all those issues and the big data, as mentioned by John. How do you think these issues will be discussed between US and EU and what it means for the transatlantic relations from a legal perspective?
Yes, well, this is the billion-dollar question. You know, what are the global challenges and how will the EU and US come together to fix them? I think we have some very good precedents for, you know, how the EU and US together can become global rule makers. A good example possibly might be in cyber lawmaking, where they got together during the Obama administration to try to get most of the world to ratify a convention that the US wasn't even a member of, and was very successful about it. And they institutionalized each other's legal orders, a lot of, you know, collaboration on the ground, and also some important work has been going on throughout the administrations at the UN level. So I think it's important to be, you know, sober and, you know, to be very, you know, level-headed about how do you engage with global challenges. Well, multilateralism matters, and the EU and US have certainly now a renewed commitment to that. It also matters to, as I've mentioned before, as Professor Ikenberry and also Professor Vinjamuri have mentioned, institutions matter, institutionalization matters as to dealing with globalization, as to dealing with global challenges. Nothing is unsolvable, but just how to engage with it. And using entities such as the UN for forums for good. We see in particular Russia and China leading the way in rulemaking where in particular the EU and US and other groups have not aligned so well. So alignment really matters amongst countries that are like-minded, committed to the rule of law, committed to human rights. And to have a solution for cyber lawmaking, I think, for example, in such a forum, is just an atypical form of rulemaking. So that would be what I would say. It looks like a very obvious place to start to generate rulemaking solutions. And you have many people in the Biden administration who know about how Europe works intimately, are not confused by its institutions, speak multiple European languages, have spent their childhood in Europe, from very high level officials to people in the background. So people who are really understanding the commonality of vision, and I think that matters, understanding human rights, the rule of law institutions on the ground in the European context, and not to be fazed by such questions.
Elaine, we have seen some discussions in the Council of Europe and also in the European Parliament and also in the US context that some countries, I think Russia has been named there in particular, try to intervene in the election process in some countries. What's your take on that? I mean, whether there were really proofs, whether this is just an allegation, and what would be the common response to such a kind of interventions in the future?
Well, I think from this perspective, the EU has a lot of problem children on its own table. It has many member states that are turning towards extraordinary levels of autocracy. The rule of law is being massively undermined. Hungary and Poland, there's multiple sets of litigation against them. There's real question marks about several countries in Central and Eastern Europe, not just Hungary and Poland. And so, any effort for the EU to be pointing its finger around the world at looking at elections, is faced with increasing skepticism, and the EU is engaging in a very difficult battle on its own doorsteps internally. There are, lots of efforts by the EU to act in official, informal, indirect capacities all over the world. But certainly there are lawmaking efforts also as to interference in elections. And I think all of these questions will come to fruition in the next while, when we see the new configuration of EU institutions. The power struggle as to the rule of law is very real in the EU, and to be pointing one's finger at other democracies and saying that isn't a democracy or that isn't a proper election, I think is coming into very serious situations, particularly where we see all the litigation pending, particularly against Hungary and Poland, about what is an independent court, what is a proper prosecutor, what is the configuration of the age of judges should retire, and so on. These are very live questions internally within the EU. So I think the US's role here as external police man, woman, person to the world, again, it matters to have support for multilateral developments, to take these issues to a higher level, because the EU is fighting, very difficult internal battles on the ground as to what is democracy, what is, appropriate behavior, and so on.
Well, I think there is disruption everywhere when it comes to the rule of law and democratization issues. I think EU is not perfect either. I think as the Germans think that the US is not perfect, I think there is also the other way around. So there is both sides do suffer from some difficulties. John, in that context, as we see that and also the European Union does not have a single foreign policy. They are not very much interested in what's happening in the Middle East, in Africa, in maybe even now there is a crisis going on in Ukraine, but there is not a single and very strong voice coming from Europe. To what extent, given the situation in the European Union, EU can be a very reliable partner for the US to promote the idea of multilateralism and also to strengthen liberal international order?
That's a great question. I think there are always problems. Democracies are imperfect, and their leaders come and go, and different leaders have different impulses. Germany is going to be changing leadership. Its longtime chancellor is going to leave the global stage. She's been a hugely profound and important figure. But having her own German view, really, of how to think about Russia and China, how to think about multilateralism, the importance of trade and trade-offs with security. I think, on balance, the underlying impulses in Europe and the United States are very much aligned for the long term. I think both the DNA of the European project, from all the way back to the 1940s, is about multilateralism. It's about building rule of law mechanisms that moderate and restrain power, that bind states together to overcome dilemmas of security and competition. So it's there, and Europe has been the silent partner in the larger global liberal order. It's been a kind of layer of stability that we've taken for granted, and we've never fully appreciated. And it's there. The next generation doesn't quite have the World War II memory, and so there's a changing of generational emphases and orientations. But generally, Europe wants America to succeed as a liberal leader, and the United States wants Europe now, certainly with Biden, wants the European project to succeed. And we can help each other. And then there are these layers of institutions that I think the G7 can come back to play an important role, because that includes Japan, but a broader governance leadership coalition of high capacity democracies, which would include South Korea and Australia and India and other countries, that can help drive the reform agenda, not to run the show, but to help put out ideas out there and to build coalitions. So I think we could see a renaissance of diplomacy of a multilateral sort that will unite the United States and Europe. Again, not as we might have seen it during the Cold War, although we tend to have selective memory about how cooperative we were during those years. We were not all together on the same page. We had lots of fights. Think about de Gaulle. Spain and Portugal had military dictatorships, so it wasn't a democracy coalition. So we should probably have an honest view about our past, but that past should also inspire us that there are overlapping value, economic, and strategic reasons to try to organize the world with a common view, and I think that will resurface in the years ahead.
I think you are optimistic for the future. I think we should all be anyway. Leslie, I think one of the challenging issues for the US and EU is the Iranian nuclear deal issue, because it seems that EU had some different approaches and had some relations with Iran, maybe not as tough as the US. Now, what is your view on that, and how this will influence the relations between the EU and US when it comes to the long-term issue with regard to the Iranian nuclear deal?
So from my vantage point, and remember that I've been based in London I was in London through all of the Donald Trump years. And my view was always that in the first year of the Trump administration, as much as he would not have been, had he run for election in the UK or in Europe, he would not have been elected. But for the first year of the Trump administration, or frankly a bit more, a lot of people said at Chatham House, British officials said, it's not great. We don't like the tweets. We don't like the rhetoric. But in fact, at the high level, working level, things are good. Things are carrying on. And it was really two things that changed that, in my view. One was the trade war, the use of sanctions, tariffs. And the second one, and the really significant one, was the decision to pull out of the Iranian nuclear deal, the JCPOA. So I think that matters hugely. I mean, this is stating the obvious, but I'll state the obvious to Europe, and I would include the UK in that. And it is what really sent a signal to Europeans that America was really not actually going to play ball and stand up to its commitments and to its transformative commitments, the ones that really laid the framework for transforming America and Europe's engagement in the Middle East, and perhaps getting to some kind of stability that would allow people to think more globally, right? The JCPOA, the decision on Afghanistan, again, you can debate that, but as a platform for thinking more strategically about the wider world and doing it collectively with Europeans. So I think that the ability to find a way forward, and I don't think anybody's naive enough to think that, we can start where we were, to find a way forward that reinvests in that deal or a version of that deal, but also brings in a broader approach to regional security will be really advantageous, not only for the region, but also for the transatlantic partnership. And I think it's absolutely essential. And it's essential to America being able to do what, they say, we hear that this current administration wants to do, which again is to think beyond the region, beyond the Middle East.
Right. Okay. Then, in this context, do you think EU and the US can bridge the gap with regard to the Iranian policy? Because, as I said, I think EU doesn't have a one voice. But when you look at the Iranian and EU deals, especially in the area of economics, I think they've got some. They don't want to. Europeans do not want to have a very strong, I think, view on the Iranian policy. Yes, Iran should follow the international, of course, rules and regulations, but I think US is tougher on that, and it seems that this is also expected from Biden too, especially by Israel. What would be the role of Israel and the Middle East in this context? Because Biden's administration is now rethinking its position, but I think it will also take into account what Saudi Arabia is thinking, Gulf countries are thinking as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think to your question, as I read it, which is the U.S. seems tougher, okay? But the U.S., as we know, the JCPOA was never widely accepted either in Congress or by Americans. And, U.S. administrations have spent a long time, since around 1979, building up Iran as a pariah in the national narrative, in the mythology. And then there are a lot of things that Iran has done, and we know, right, in the region with the question with respect to its nuclear program, et cetera, which have fed into that. And the JCPOA was easy to undo because it was never really widely accepted. So I think the Biden administration faces the domestic constraint. It needs to be tough, but it also clearly would like to reinvest in that deal. And I don't think that same set of constraints is operative in Europe, certainly not manifest in the same way. So I think it's a different calculation, in part for domestic political reasons. But I do think that there is a broader understanding of the need to not only get a JCPOA back, but also to rethink about the region as a whole, and to get the Gulf, to get Saudi, to get to broker an arrangement that brings regional stability, because that's really what is absolutely critical, again, for America doing what it wants to do, which is to free itself up from some of its commitments in Europe, and also to delegate those, to let Europe lead, which I think is potentially trickier, but to let Europe lead more when it comes to the Middle East, so that America can think further afield.
Well, I think there's a huge debate on the role of US in the Middle East and the intention of withdrawal from this region. I think that will continue. But also, I think that's a challenge. Maybe also John can later on reply to this. If US will withdraw from the US to a large extent, how then it will bring about its claims of establishing order and also multilateralism if US is shifting towards, let's say, Asia, rather than other countries. Maybe we can also look at this a little bit later. But let me turn to Elaine. Elaine, Brexit has been, I think, a shifting point for UK and also for the EU. EU became weaker, and there's a lot of debate. And also, there are some, I think, legal issues with regard to the withdrawal of United Kingdom when it comes to Northern Ireland. What will be the challenges that we will face in the Northern Ireland, and how this issue will be a point of agreement or disagreement between US and EU, because I think US would like to see some sort of peace and security in the region, but now there's a tension going on and increasing in the Northern Ireland.
Well, it's an interesting question you pose as to the role of the US in Brexit, because to start, the Trump administration was one of the greatest cheerleaders of Brexit and the destabilization of Europe, right? And you've described Brexit as being a negative, but one of the most important positives to come out of Brexit for the EU was its coherency as between the 27 on maintaining a position, on all issues with the United Kingdom. And I think it's, and I'm an Irish American. I lived through the Brexit referendum in London, endlessly mentioning Northern Ireland. I did my undergraduate degrees in Trinity College Dublin in a law school with half the population from half of the law school from Northern Ireland, people who had come through the peace process, people who were the children of the Good Friday Agreement, as it were. So, it affected me personally very greatly to see how much it was ignored, the Northern Irish question, throughout the Brexit campaign. And the US has been consistently good in this since Joe Biden's campaign as an Irish American has been extremely forthright on the importance of stability in Northern Ireland, and has been voicing concerns in the last few weeks. Whereas the Johnson administration, the Westminster, does not want to go visit even Northern Ireland. They've made extraordinary claims. So I think the US's role here as global policeman, has been very important in having a grown-up consensus on the need for peace, and that Brexit could not lead to any positive outcomes other than the division of the United Kingdom, legally, which has taken place now. Northern Ireland is aligned with the European Union legally on key questions, and that is why there's a huge amount of disruption. Some might say, others would say, no, it's not. It's just opportunism from the fragility of the place of peace in Northern Ireland, and it's been the lone voice of people such as certain members of Congress and so on, who've been very forthright in expressing the need for stability, which has been completely absent from Westminster. So, I mean, asking me what is the place of Brexit in the future of the EU is a very different question to Northern Ireland, because there's a lot of EU law that still applies. Asking me the question as to the place of the US, that's a very different question altogether. But all in all, Brexit is not something. There's no winners or losers. There's no winners from Brexit overall, right? But still, the EU is almost half a billion consumers. It's 440 million people, following the same rules. It's an enormous market, trade actor in the world. The UK is trying to desperately haggle out deals with half the world, rolling over lots of agreements very imperfectly. And Northern Ireland sits legally between all of this. So, there's lots of stuff in the UK media about the role of a trade agreement with the US and standards and so on. So that would be how I would frame it.
Okay, but let me turn to Leslie before she leaves. I think she will be leaving us in a few minutes. Leslie, I just would like to raise the issue of leadership. We all talked about the institutions. Yes, these are very, I think, important issues. But also, I think Europe and US and the whole world actually needs stronger leadership. In the EU now, we don't see those strong leaders. I think Merkel, as John said, she is leaving. And who is left behind? I mean, do you see that the leadership, there's a lack of leadership in the EU?
So, I mean, with a great deal of respect for those who have faced the challenge of leadership through probably the greatest challenge of a generation, which is to say the COVID-19 pandemic. And far be it from me to suggest that, that's not an incredibly difficult period to have tried to lead through. And we now know in hindsight perhaps what many people should have done, as we know what maybe people should have done on questions of Iran or China. But I think we have to remember that at least for the last 13 or 14 months, our leaders have faced considerable challenges at home and have necessarily been focused on trying to keep their people and their economies alive. Leadership, I think, is a complicated thing also because, of course, Donald Trump was a very strong leader, right? He wasn't, I will speak personally, he wasn't my leader, and he was not a leader that I would have ever wished on the United States. But he was a very effective leader for what he actually wanted to do, which was to divide Americans and to deregulate the economy, and to bring taxes down, and to embed a certain vocal minority politics in the United States. He was a very effective leader. We shouldn't fool ourselves into thinking that he wasn't. He just didn't share my goals and many of my colleagues' goals or strategies. So I wish for us to have strong, effective leaders that share my values and the values that I think are the values of many of my colleagues in the UK and friends and my fellow Americans, to be frank. So I think we have to be really careful when we talk about leadership because we make a series of assumptions that that we all want the same thing and we don't all want the same thing. But the ability to lead in partnership is critical. I think being able to lead at home in a world that is so interconnected and where the challenges are so transnational, and the pandemic is the most obvious one. I think especially in the United States, prior to the last few months, I think it's really changing now, but I think previously that I heard a lot of Americans talking about the pandemic as a national problem. The pandemic is not a national problem. As we know, and as wonderful as the vaccination rollout has been, the important step is global reckoning on vaccine inequality and leadership from the United States on really altering the playing field on that. So we do need stronger leaders, and we need leaders who help each other out. But we really need to invest in leaders that share values and actually to build them up. So rather than who's on deck or who's the opposition and who's standing in the election, who are the 30? I mean, many of our leaders are younger, but who are the up and coming leaders that we can help to cultivate and build so that there's a really good pipeline. And obviously, diversity is going to be critical to that. But I think that it's a really key point. And thank you for asking the question because I think it's something that we all think about quite a lot. I've really enjoyed this. I really deeply appreciate the opportunity because I have so much respect for Professor John Ikenberry, and it's wonderful to meet Professor Fahey. I've really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for joining us, Leslie. Thank you. John, I think we can now look at the U.S. withdrawal from the region because it's been mentioned before, and to what extent that would impact U.S. Role in the international fora, because as many people argue that now U.S. is shifting its foreign policy towards, Southeast Asia or Asia in general. And also, I think Leslie mentioned that the U.S. is expecting more initiative from the EU to engage in the Middle Eastern issues. Is that really the case? And how realistic that case is if there's such an expectation from the U.S. side?
Well, if I could slightly, that's a great question, just slightly add a complication to your question, because I think we haven't fully brought on board in this discussion two crisis points that relate to U.S.-European relations. And one is the relating to Russia on the Ukrainian border and China as it relates to Taiwan. So if I could just for a moment suggest that the Biden administration is going to be tested in the next months and perhaps years on how it and its partners respond to what Putin's Russia is doing with Ukraine, military buildup with offensive capabilities on the eastern border of Ukraine. And then in Taiwan, China is flying military aircraft increasingly into Taiwan air zone, and of course is speaking a rhetoric that should cause a great deal of worry about whether the countries that have supported informally Ukraine and Taiwan can continue to send the right signals to deter these two powers from doing what I would say is really unthinkable from our commitment to a stable global order, which is the use of military force to annex or to overtake these two entities. So I don't have a recommendation for the Biden administration other than to do what we've been talking about today, which is to build the international consensus on how to deal with trouble spots and the peaceful settlement of disputes, the role of diplomacy and deterrence in making sure that Russia and China don't overstep as they test the Biden administration. And so the U.S. is, to answer your question, I do think the U.S. wants to reduce its footprint in the Middle East. Afghan is the case in point. And I think there will be a real interest in seeing what Europe can do. I think, as Professor Vinjamuri mentioned, it's very problematic what Europe can do as a kind of substitute for American regional military security provision. But I think that together there has to be a kind of renegotiation of how these Western states go about projecting power and influence into the Middle East.
Well, thank you. I think my last question is to Elaine. I think COVID has been mentioned on a number of times. And what are the challenges that it brought to the legal, let's say, issues when it comes to having vaccinations, access to health services, or sharing the burden by the international community?
Well, this, of course, is the million-dollar question. COVID, like any area of crisis for the European Union, is an area where it has complex or limited or patchy competences. So, for example, the migration crisis, Eurozone, any kind of area where there is doubt or questioning about the EU's capacity to do something is largely because it doesn't have lots of power. So the EU doesn't normally buy, hundreds of millions of vaccines for its population. It's taken over national powers. And this has been a very imperfect, very difficult question. It doesn't have enormous competences in the area of health. So it has been a very complex learning exercise for the EU. It's learned many harsh lessons. Things have gone very badly. I think from the transatlantic perspective, it'll be interesting to see how vaccine nationalism, export controls in laws are, to what extent the US and the EU will, some questions of solidarity here will enter into the fray, because there's very little US vaccines circulation in the EU, and the EU has largely been an exporter, and yet gets it's massively in the negative in news, particularly in British news, for example, about its roles generally. So as a classic soft power, the EU always is very easy to criticize. It doesn't, it is an entity which is a very important force for the rule of law, human rights, multilateralism. But in this context, we see the idea of nationalism, borders, stopping sharing and solidarity has been things that have gotten the EU into the front pages, particularly, for example, with Australia. So it's been quite a disastrous situation on one level, or on the other hand, you can also say that it's a classic situation where the EU doesn't have a lot of powers, competences in lawmaking. And I think it'll be very important to see in the next few months the legal provisions here being evolved as to export controls and so on, how the EU can engage in solidarity with in particular with less developed economies. Developing economies will have a huge issue going forward.
Well, thank you very much. With that, we come to the end of our debate, and I just would like to thank you very much for your participation, Professor John Ikenberry and Professor Elaine Fahey. Thank you very much, and goodbye from TRT World Digital Debates. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Bye.